at Matthew chapter 21, and I'll read the passage. And really, as we think about Palm Sunday and recognize what happened on that day. Matthew chapter 21, in verse 1, it says, "Now when they drew near Jerusalem," this is speaking about Jesus and his disciples. It says, "and came to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, 'Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied, and a colt with her. Loose them, and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, and immediately he will send them.' All this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, 'Tell the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, lowly and sitting on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey.' So the disciples went and did as Jesus commanded them. They brought the donkey and the colt, laid their clothes on them, and set him on them. And a very great multitude spread their clothes on the road. Others cut down branches from trees and spread them on the road. Then the multitudes who went before and those who followed cried out, saying, 'Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest.' And when he had come into Jerusalem, all the city was moved, saying, 'Who is this?' So the multitude said, 'This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee.'" As you read through that passage and you see what is taking place and what is unfolding in this time, really, in one sense, you could say this was a coronation of Jesus as he's entering in to Jerusalem. It wasn't that long ago, and we had a coronation here in this country. And you see the pomp and the circumstance, the splendor, the crowds. In one sense, you had a lot of that, but you didn't have Jesus in that pomp and circumstance, if you will. But he rides in lowly, meek, on a donkey. But in one sense, as you see what the crowd is saying at this point, what would cause them in less than a week's time to go from shouting Hosanna to the Son of David to crucify him? Crucify him. Think about that. Same crowd. In the matter of days, their attitudes and their actions changed from shouting, "Hosanna! Hosanna!" which literally means, "Save us! Save us!" to kill him. Kill him. And you know, when you see the extreme going from one end to the other, we have to look at ourselves and say, what would cause me to do that? What would cause me to turn? Now, sometimes it's easy to reflect on other people, but have you ever had somebody who was close to you? A friend, a family member, a coworker, maybe even a partner, and they seemed to adore you. They praised you. They were close to you. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like instead of adoring you, they abhorred you. Instead of loving you, they hated you. Instead of praising you, they criticized you. And it seemed like it changed. And before you could do nothing wrong in their eyes, now it seems that you do everything wrong in their eyes. I hope it's not a current partner. That's the way it is. But, you know, we may have had that happen to us. And what happened for the breakdown? So often, it is unmet expectations or undesired actions, right? One of the things is before Anna and I got married, we were doing premarital counseling, and it was actually Anna's dad that married us, and it was his requirement that he would do 8 premarital counseling for anybody that he married. So lovely, we got to do premarital counseling with Anna's dad. your future father-in-law. But I think with that, actually, he was easier on me than he was on Anna. I think he kind of put more emphasis on her. But one of the things I remember him mentioning was about the dangers of expectations. How many of us have had a special day ruined because your expectations were not met? Birthday, Christmas, Valentine's Day, an anniversary, and you got all excited because, your partner is going to do something amazing, right? And then all of a sudden, they didn't come through. And the whole day was ruined. You ever had that happen? Now you've just gotten so far along that you just don't expect anything, right? And if they do any little thing, it just blows you away just because you've gotten so used to them not meeting that expectations. But unmet expectations can ruin any relationship. And really what happened here was unmet expectations. Leading up to this point, now Matthew, he records just before this about Jesus. He was in Jericho. He had healed a blind man. He's on his way to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Now, just a little glimpse of what the Passover was all about, going all the way back to Exodus chapter 12. Maybe you've watched the movie, is it The Prince of Egypt? I forget if that's about Moses or if that's about Joseph. But going back, thinking about Moses and how they left Egypt just before God parted the Red Sea. But on the way out, we may be familiar with the 10 plagues of Egypt. And finally, Pharaoh drives the people out because the final plague was the Passover. The angel, they would have to put they would sacrifice the lamb, they put the blood on the doorpost, and the angel would pass over the homes that had the blood on the doorpost. And those that did not have the blood on the doorpost, the firstborn child died. And so it was known as the Passover. And when that happened, all of the Egyptian homes, the firstborn had passed away. And there was great grieving in Egypt. And Pharaoh finally came to the point, it was the 10th plague, and he finally said, "Get out of the country. In fact, we will give you possessions. We will give you of jewels and gold." And really, in a sense, the Israelites finally left, and they had great spoil from the Egyptians. But there was a promise throughout the centuries that there would be another deliverer who would come. Another, the one that was the Messiah, the one who would deliver them. And this anticipation was looked at every single year. They would gather together and celebrate the Passover. People from all around Israel and even beyond, Jews, would travel into Jerusalem to celebrate. They say that there was about 40,000 people that lived in Jerusalem, but at the time of the Passover, in fact, they said about a decade later, it was recorded about 200,000 lambs were sacrificed at the Passover. And they say that up to 10 people, a sacrifice could be made for up to 10 people. So even if you were to limit it down, each family, and maybe you say a family of 4 people or 5 people, well, that's already about 800 to 1 million people all coming in to Jerusalem at the same time. Now, when you reflect on all that is happening, and over the last 3 years in Jesus' ministry, and anybody from Galilee, which was up by the Sea of Galilee, that area, which is where Jesus did most of his miracles, they knew about Jesus. They had heard him teach. They had seen the miracles that he did time and time and time again. Now get a little closer, as Matthew mentions here at the end of chapter 20, and how he had healed Bartimaeus, who had been blind. And he was there in Jericho, and he heals him. And then also Luke mentions about Zacchaeus, which was in that same town, in that same time. Nobody had ever heard of somebody healing the blind. And in Jericho, the talk about Jesus healing the blind. People traveling into Jerusalem from Jericho, following along with Jesus. When he gets near Jerusalem, he stops in Bethany. And John mentions about his time there in Bethany, how he stopped in at Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' home. And it was only not too long ago that he had raised Lazarus from the dead. And so anybody in that community, Bethany, Bethphage, the outskirts of Jerusalem, the talk was about how Jesus had raised the dead. So no matter where people were from, they had been hearing all about Jesus. And Jesus, it mentions there in verse at the very beginning, he comes to Bethphage. He sends his 2 disciples forward to find a donkey and its colt. He says, bring them to me. He says, you're going to be asked why you're taking them. I mean, if you go up and you just start untying a donkey, people are going to ask you, hey, what are you doing? Especially the owner, right? Now, most likely, they knew there must have been some type of connections. Because when the response came, the Lord has need of him, they knew exactly who the disciples were referring to. And they said, go ahead and take him. But Jesus knew this was going to be his final week before he was crucified. He was fulfilling prophecy from Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9. And it even mentions there, that passage, the daughter of Zion, there in verse 5. Tell the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, lowly and sitting on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. This was a prophecy many hundreds of years before. And Jesus specifically requested the donkey and its colt. The disciples placed their coats on him. And you see the different accounts from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Here it even mentions the people laid down branches, but some of the other gospel records mention there were palm branches that were cut down. And this was a reflection, really, any king that was coronated at the time. The people would do this. In fact, it mentions about them, the people laying down their coats on the road, making a path. Today we think about laying out the red carpet, right? It is an honor. It is respect. Well, back then they didn't even have pavement. It was all just dirt roads. But the people laying down the palm branches in honor, laying down their coats in honor and respect. And even in another sign, it was saying, I am at your service. You can walk over me. I am yours. As Jesus travels in, the people go before him, follow after him, and notice the shouts that are saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. That reference, Son of David, was the most pronounced, really, reflection of the Messiah. It was a title for the promised one. Going back to David, who had been the greatest king of Israel. And the promise that had been given to David, that one from his seed would become king, whose kingdom would have no end. And the people were looking and waiting for the deliverer. And if there was a time of the year to reflect about a deliverer, it was always the Passover. Because the Passover, as I mentioned, was a memory of the deliverance from Egypt. And all of this anticipation was building up. Have you ever watched a movie and you just see the climax raising and building up? And sometimes the first time you watch it, you're just in awe and you're on the edge of your seat wondering what's going to happen next. Now, after you've watched it several times, you're like, oh, it's old news, right? And sometimes when we read the story about Jesus, well, we know the end of the story. But imagine if you were there with the disciples, traveling in. Remember last week we looked at Jesus' pronunciation or the announcement as Peter recognizes him. You are the Christ. In another sense, you are the King. But then Jesus responded how he was going to go to Jerusalem, die, and rise again, which the disciples did not understand that. But here they are, they're entering in. The anticipation is building. The excitement is building. The people are shouting out, Hosanna to the Son of David. What were they looking for? A deliverer at that time. What were they saying is they shouted out Hosanna, which means save us. Save us. In a sense, save us now, Son of David. Save us now, coming King. Now, if I was to ask you today, if there was one request that you could give that you believe would change your life for the better, what would it be? Just one request that if that happened, your life would be so much better. Well, I think all of us, we might be able to give a different answer. Some might just say, you know what, if I had a better job, I am sick and tired of my job. And if I had a better job, life would be so much easier. I wouldn't come home stressed. I would have more money, which would allow me to do more things. For other people, it might say, if I had a bigger house, my house is too small and too cramped for our family. Some might say, you know what, if I had better health, I just can't do the things that I used to do. And each one of us, we could give different answers, but one question is, whatever we say today, would it be the same 10, 20, or 30 years from now? Your biggest trial or problem in life today, will it be the same 20, 30 years from now? Well, if you need a bigger house today, 30 years from now, it might be empty, and then you're saying, I need a smaller house because it's too big to clean and dust. So what our biggest problem today, if it was solved, could it become a big problem later on in life? Well, the disciples and the Jews, what they were looking for was a deliverer from Rome. Rome ruled them. And they wanted freedom, liberty. And as Jesus comes in, people begin questioning, who is this? Maybe there were the crowd that they didn't know who he was, with people from all over Israel, from people beyond Israel who had traveled into Jerusalem. And there were many people who knew about Jesus, but there were still many who did not know about him. And they said, who is he? And they respond, he's a prophet. This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee. But as we come on to the next verse, in verse 12, now as I believe it's Mark mentions that Jesus went into the temple, he looked around, but it was late in the day, so he went off to Bethany. And then he comes back the next day. Matthew and Luke don't mention about it being the next day, but that does not make it a contradiction. It just means they left out some of the information. This, as they were recording, they're just trying to help us understand all that was happening. And so according to Mark, this was the next day that he comes back. But in verse 12, it says, "Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves.' Then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple and saying, 'Hosanna to the Son of David,' they were indignant and said to him, 'Do you hear what these are saying?' And Jesus said to them, 'Yes. Have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have perfected praise?' Then he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there." As you read through that passage, when you think about Jesus coming in, the Messiah, the promised one, the one everyone is shouting out, "Hosanna to the Son of David," what would you expect the first thing to be when he enters into Jerusalem? Well, if you're wanting him to deliver you from Rome, head off to the Roman fort and clear out the Romans, right? And all of the Jews would have gotten behind that. I mean, he had fed the multitudes from a sack lunch. He had healed the blind, the maimed. He had raised the dead. What greater leader could you have in an uproar against Rome? But what did Jesus do? He went to the very place the people went to for comfort. He went to the very place that they were putting their hope in. And he started clearing out the temple. Not the Romans, but the temple. What was happening there? Well, what was going on in the temple, that was where they would take their Passover lamb. That's where they would have their sacrifices. But on the way in, there was the Gentile court, which was the area, the only area of the temple that Gentiles were allowed in. But what had taken place is they had set up merchants there. Now, you were only allowed to offer a lamb if it had no blemishes. And imagine if you had a 100-mile journey with a lamb, and you're making it so close, and a few miles out, that lamb trips and falls and gets a big gouge on its leg. Now you wouldn't be able to sacrifice that lamb because it had to be a lamb without blemish. So what people would do is they would travel and buy the lamb in Jerusalem. Not just in Jerusalem, but at the temple. And some historians say that some of the time the prices would be hiked up 10 times the amount of what a typical lamb would cost. They were ripping people off. Not only that, but you would have to pay your temple tax. And your temple tax, they would not accept something that had, well, Roman money, that had the imprint of the empire on it. Instead, you would have to come and exchange your money for the Jewish currency. And when that exchange, well, have you ever exchanged money at the airport? It's not the same as what you see when you check out the exchange rate, is it? No, they price it up high. And that's what was taking place here. And it wasn't just about buying and selling or exchanging, but the religious leaders were profiting off of the sale of the sacrifices. They were profiting off of religion. Now, in one sense, you could say this was a blessing to the people, but on the other hand, it's not what they were hoping for. They had put up with the corruption in religion, But they were all right with that. They were still going to take their sacrifice in because that is what was commanded. And however it happened to get to that point, they dealt with that. What they really wanted solved were the Romans. But here, as Jesus came in, he overturns the table of the money changers. He drives out those who were buying and those who were selling. He was clearing out the temple. And he quoted Scripture. He says, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." You know, when we stop and think about the greatest deliverance that I could have, there are many reflections on what we would answer. Many different things that we all would say, if this happened, then I would feel like a new person. But the question is that the greatest need? Now, as Jesus came in, there was another picture. Not only was he coming in as king, but as it mentions, a lowly king. But there was another picture that on the 10th day of Nisan, the lamb was brought into the home back in Exodus. And on the 14th day, then it was sacrificed. And as Jesus was entering into Jerusalem, he was entering in as that unblemished lamb who would be soon the true Passover lamb. Every one of the Passover lambs from the past were a picture of the true Passover lamb in the future. And when it comes down to our greatest need, I think we could all say our greatest need is the guilt inside of us being relieved. For so many people, there is a guilt in all of us. Why do we try to improve ourselves? Because we feel we're lacking. Why do we try to accomplish or to make ourselves look better? We look in the mirror. We make ourselves look better because we want to be accepted. And there is a longing in all of us for acceptance, for that guilt to be removed. And when we see Jesus going in, really it wasn't about delivering from Rome. Because that would have only been for a time and a period for a certain people. But what Jesus had come was a deliverance for every human being, for every generation. And that was to make the payment for our sin, to cleanse us from our guilt, for our shame. And over the next few days, as the people were recognizing he is not coming to do what we have asked him to do, he is not coming to do what we were expecting him to do, all of a sudden the crowd had changed. And it went from Hosanna to the Son of David to crucify him. Crucify him. Just recently, Nathan and his class, they've been going through Chronicles of Narnia and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. They've been reading it. They've been watching the movie. And I remember there's a phrase in that, a question when they hear about Aslan. Is he a tame lion? And the answer, he is not tame, but he is good. What does it mean to be tame? Well, if I have a tame animal, I can control it. It does my bidding. Very good. You've got that. Got the flashing lights going on the side, a little disco. But a tame animal, it follows my instructions. It follows my lead. And when you think about Aslan, a picture really of God, is he a tame lion? He is not tame. He does not do my bidding. He does not follow my lead, but he is good. And you know, I've seen and I've heard and I've met many people who said, I won't follow him because, and maybe it might be something in their past, he was not there when I needed him. Well, in a sense, it might have been somebody who was ill didn't recover. Somebody who you prayed for, your prayers weren't answered. And because of that, there was an expectation that God would pull through for you. But when that didn't happen, you say, I don't want anything to do with God. In one sense, that was exactly what was happening for them. Jesus, we want you to deliver us from Rome. Wait a minute, what are you doing in the temple, clearing out the temple? Leave the temple alone. Leave our worship alone. You take care of our enemies, not our area of worship. And when he didn't fulfill the expectations, they turned on him and said, crucify him, crucify him. And you know, we have to reflect in our lives. What is our expectation of Jesus? Especially when we understand all that he did. He has the power to heal. So why doesn't he heal? He has the power to remove these obstacles out of my life. So why doesn't he? And all of a sudden, when we start asking questions, we think, if he has the power, but he doesn't, then he must not care. But the real question, is that our greatest need? And how long would that solve our problem? He did not come just to solve our temporary problems. But he was looking beyond all of that. Our eternal problem, if you will. Our sin. And that is why he came into this world. And only a few days later, after this passage, he was put on the cross, crucified. They placed him in the tomb. But on that third day, he rose again, victorious, to give us hope. There is one thing in common for every single one of us. Well, two things. Right now, we are all alive, right? But there's also another thing in common. One day, we will all die. We don't like to think about that. And so whatever the problem we face today, when we consider death, well, these problems are very insignificant. And Jesus didn't come to solve all of our everyday problems. He came to solve the real problem. When we die in our sin, in our guilt, what then? But that's where Jesus, he came. He was the perfect lamb, the one without blemish, the one without sin, the one who went to the cross in my place and took my sin upon himself. He made the payment I should have made. He died, was buried, and rose again. And he invites all to follow him, to receive the forgiveness he offers, so that we can have that relationship with God. So that even when we pass from this world, we will rise and spend eternity with him in heaven. When we look at this passage and we reflect in our own lives when we see Jesus and consider Jesus, are there certain expectations that we have of him? And what happens when he doesn't fulfill those expectations? And do we recognize the true reason of why he came.